Okay, so I'm getting back to Karl Marx ideas. So I talked about the A part and the B part, and you read the text and you talked about dialectical materialism. The concept of the dialectic in history and the idea of change comes from Hegel. That's the German philosophy, and came out of a philosophical tradition called idealist. One is also Fichte comes to mind. And then Feuerbach was also an influence for those of you who care. And this idea of the dialectic, okay, is a theory that's history advances in stages as a result of the conflict between different ideas and social groups. Now, more precisely, this was also called historical materialism. That's not a term that they put in the text. It's more common to use the term dialectical materialism, but it's more precise to say historical materialism. That historical materialism by Marx was about the dialectic. And so what does that mean? Okay, so basically Karl Marx saw history moving in a direction through the dialectic. There is a thesis, there's an established order, and there's something that it's opposed to it, an antithesis. And they clash, and then they have a change of the order, and something synthesizes into a thesis, and then it finds its antithesis again, and it keeps moving in this, like, it's a kind of complex philosophical concept. So with the French Revolution, as you remember, I was telling you, that's a great place to start. It's not where it all starts for him, but it's a significant part, to just for the sake of time, to say that monarchy. Okay, so remember, modern historians don't believe that it was such a simple thing as to say that the bourgeoisie overthrew the feudal world order in the French Revolution. But that's been the main interpretation for a while, and that was certainly Marx's understanding of it. So the thesis would be, or the establishment of history would be, a feudal society with a monarchy. And then it would be the rise through economic means of production of a merchant class that's going to be called the bourgeoisie. And he's going to see that the interests of the monarchy and the interests of the business class, in his theory, are going to be opposed to each other. There's going to be a conflict. And I don't think that they use that term. Yes, class conflict is another important term that they did not highlight in this text. Okay, so he is going to see that this conflict can't get resolved, and so inevitably you lead to a revolution. And so he then sees the feudal world order having different set of interests than the capitalist world order, capitalist industrialist world order to be specific, and then they rise to power, and the old order is destroyed, and we move to a next phase of history. Now, then Karl Marx says, okay, so capitalism is the advanced stage of history, and it's the most dynamic. I mean, after all, he does a total study of capital. He has a large volumes, 3-volume work called Capital, Das Kapital, okay, where he analyzes and breaks down capitalism. And but he sees there to be an inherent class conflict, set of contradictions built in the system. So this is what Karl Marx says. Your boss, what does he want to do? Maximize profit. That makes sense. That's logical. It's not evil. That's what's the market. That's what the whole point of it is. What do you as a worker want? You want the highest wage. That's not evil. That makes sense. You want to get paid. You want money as well, right? So your boss wants to pay you as little as possible, and you want to make as much as possible. Aha! This is an inherent clash of interests built into the system, according to Karl Marx. The landlord wants to charge you as much as possible to live in the place that you're going to rent from. You want to pay the least. Same thing. So we're going on. A conflict of interest. And for him, this is going to be irreconcilable. you're not going to be able to, and this is where many people say that Karl Marx had it wrong, that, I mean, he saw that the world would have had a massive communist revolution already by now, it appears, that capitalism was never going to resolve its differences, and that dialectic, that conflict and that clash would lead to a proletarian revolution in which the workers would take power and create a dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, he didn't want, this is a misunderstanding. The Soviet Union used this term as well, dictatorship of the proletariat. In theory, many criticize that the Soviet Union was a dictatorship over the proletariat, but it said not dictatorship over the proletariat, but dictatorship of. The theory that Engels lays out is that all states are dictatorships. The state has total power and it crushes those that are opposed to its interest. A capitalist state is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie or a dictatorship of capitalists. That ultimately, no matter what freedoms are allowed, the police force and the state will crush oppositions to the interests of private property and capital. The theory then, this is what they're saying in theory, that in a communist state, and this is articulated in Lenin's State and Revolution, if you were going to read that, he comes later, and he looks to Engels' ideas, is that the workers would rise to power and they would have a state that squashes interests opposed to the workers and that would try to bring back capitalism. In other words, it would be a defense of the workers. It would be a repression of all that's opposed to them. And so the theory then for the Marxists was essentially that all states are repressive, so they're not communists. Anarchists. We'll talk more about that later. And they believe only in the future, when communism takes place on a more natural level, that over time, as socialism becomes natural and all the economy becomes socialized, and the social and economic relations between society become more natural, and there's no more conflicts with the rest of the world and the global economy, and this is set in place, that the state will no longer need to function in that way, and it will wither away. So in a sense, communism advocates a kind of future anarchism where the state comes in really strong and powerful, and then eventually over time would just wither away. Now, there's a lot of people to criticize a lot about that. Again, though, my point is I'm trying to tell you is that Marxism was a highly theoretical system, and that's ultimately what we're talking about. And it was calling for the overthrow of the world order. The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, written with Engels, starts off by saying there's a specter haunting Europe, and the specter is communism, and then ends with workers of the world unite. Okay, it was a threat to this capitalist industrial world order. The irony is that he saw this coming out of the industrial Western world, this communist revolution, and to everyone's shock, which I will not have time to get into and explain, Russia, that was seen as the least likely in the European sphere to go communist, Vietnam, Cambodia, he didn't say peasants of the world unite. China had the majority peasants. How does this then come into place? This is going to be the interesting thing about history, but we don't have time to get into it. But just to say, that's Karl Marx and communism. He called it scientific socialism because he felt like he tapped into a scientific approach to history, and he figured out the laws of the economy and nature. He saw this kind of in line with Darwinian evolution, that this was kind of all a part of the same thing. He saw religion as the shackles of the old world order. And, that's the other side of this, is that he is going to be a materialist, meaning not into materialism like, oh, I want the bling bling, but his materialism is meaning a world in which God does not exist, where you can explain all things through science and philosophy. Okay, and he had a saying in his earlier writings, philosophy interprets the world in many different ways. The point is to change it. And so he has an idea that is about change. and many are going to see this. And so here he is. Many people are going to have a lot of complex, long thoughts about this guy, and it hasn't gone away. While on one hand, his ideas seem so utterly discredited, on the other hand, with a world of such wealth disparity, and I mean serious wealth disparity, and it's getting worse, Karl Marx, his ghost doesn't leave us, and you are going to find people accused of communism more, and you're going to see popularity in Marx's ideas rising up. There already is that. Bernie Sanders, by the way, who's running for president as an independent, you may or may not have heard of him, his popularity is growing. He certainly is most likely not going to get elected, but Bernie Sanders says he's a democratic socialist, and he says a lot of ideas that come out of Karl Marx. The Democratic Party get accused of embracing his ideas. They don't, but they sure take a lot of his rhetoric. Okay, I would argue that they use that more rhetorically than they do actually. That's another debate. But he certainly left a legacy with the other socialist movement that in Europe is openly advocated or talked about, and in America is kind of guised within the Democratic Party and then criticized by the conservatives on the right and the Republican. Okay, so that's where we're at there. By the way, he loved America. He almost considered immigrating to Texas. He wrote heavily on the U.S. Civil War. He wrote as a foreign correspondent for a New York newspaper, and he loved Abraham Lincoln. Truth is stranger than fiction. I'm not kidding. I have a big book of Karl Marx's writings on the U.S. Civil War. That's a little known fact. All right, moving on. By the way, could you imagine if he moved to Texas? You know, all of his kids would have probably been conservative senators or something. They would have been like, "Oh, that was crazy, Grandpa." You know. Anyways, okay, moving on. So, all right. Now we're moving to nationalism. Nationalism seems like such a given in the modern world. To be a nationalist, a patriot, right? To have a unity of the people, to raise the flag, God and country, and guns. Something like this is just such a fundamental thing. And if you're not, what's up? What's going on, right? Okay. Well, it's not a given until later on around this time, because you have a world of monarchies. Monarchies were multicultural, multi-ethnic, and as I've pointed out before, and if you've seen some of the documentaries, or if you looked at the Catherine the Great one, many monarchs didn't even speak the language of the people that they were ruling over. Okay. And so, as the feudal world is breaking down, there is this new thing emerging called the modern nation state. And it's a complicated thing. So you have a nation, the concept of a nation, a large community of people who possess a sense of unity based on a belief. And it's a belief, not a fact, okay? That they have a common homeland and share a similar culture. It's a concept, okay? Nationalism, as it's defined, is the belief that the people who form a nation should have their own political institutions, and that the interests of the nation should be defended and promoted at all costs. Okay, and then they have a state with a structure to actually make that a reality. That again is something that we consider a given of the modern world, but in certain parts of the world, it has become complicated to make happen, and others not. If you look at World War I, and especially World War II is a great example, and what we're going to see happen with Hitler, that was the big question, the unresolved issues that took place from this time about national identity and where the borders should be drawn. Okay, that it was never this perfect. There were German speakers all throughout Europe that's been there for centuries. What about Jews and Roma people known as gypsies? Where do they belong in all of this? Okay, I'm going to end right there, and I'll return to this topic in the next lecture.